Okay. This is the one time of my life where I feel very powerful, when there's lots of noise and then suddenly it becomes quiet because I spoke. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the Policy Advisory Committee. This is our 4th meeting of the Committee for the Portland Metro Area Value Pricing Feasibility Analysis. Glad to have you all here. Welcome to those observers out in the audience. Really glad to have you here as well. Before we go too far, why don't we do introductions around the PAC tables? And you'll notice that we're set up differently today, and I'll address that in just a bit. But you still have the same old microphones that you're sharing, and we'll still be doing our regular stuff for a little bit at least. So I'm going to start. Chris, why don't you start with introductions?
Chris Edgar, Oregon Environmental Council.
And you do have microphones because we are streaming, so.
Chris Edgar,
For the 7th time.
Chris Hagerbaumer, Oregon Environmental Council.
Curtis Robinhold from the Port of Portland.
Park Woodworth Ride Connection.
Ryan Winsheimer, ODOT Region 1.
Craig Dirksen, Metro Council.
Next table.
Bernie Bottomley, TriMet.
Brendan Finn, City of Portland.
Ann McInerney-Ogle, Mayor of Vancouver.
Orlando Simpson, OTC.
Jana Jarvis, Oregon Trucking Association.
Pam Treese, Westside Economic Alliance.
Garrett Kransky with the Street Trust.
Sean O'Halloran, Oregon Transportation Commission.
Paul Savas, Clackamas County Commission.
Jessica Vega-Peterson, Multnomah County Commission.
Phil Ditzler, Federal Highway Administration.
I'm Judith Gray, Project Manager for ODOT.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate that. So before I go over the agenda and how we're going to run the meeting, let me just do my normal getting you oriented to the room. If you need restrooms, go out the doors that you came in through, straight down the hall. About halfway down on the left-hand side, there's a little corridor, and the restrooms are in that corridor. And as always, if we need to make an emergency exit for any reason, follow the red exit signs. The best way, though, even though there's not a sign here, I think, go out the big doors, take a right, and we'll be right outside. So again, I always say that, so we don't have to employ that maneuver. We are really happy to be moving kind of with this meeting today, moving from a lot of talking to you, bringing you a lot of information as the PAC, and actually organizing today's meeting so that you get to talk with each other and start to work on putting together kind of your thoughts and your ideas to start the basis of developing recommendations. We really wanted to use this session to call on your expertise now, which is why you're at these tables, because you do bring expertise and local knowledge to the proceedings here. So as I said, we're going to have a lot less technical presentations. We have a couple of short ones that kind of help set the stage for the discussions. But other than that, we will primarily be having you talk with each other, first at small groups and then back as a larger group, still from the small tables, though. As we talk today about policy issues, mitigation, things like that, I wanted to note that there will be a lot of trade-offs that you'll be, talking about within your small groups as you think about what policy considerations might work for this particular area, the Portland metro region. And also think about, are there policies that you might suggest or have heard about from other places that may be too constraining for this region? So those are the kinds of things that we expect will surface in your conversations today. And, be thinking about how will these policies help or might they hinder the success of value pricing. So it will be an interesting shift for you all today to start thinking about that. So we will, as always, get comments from the PAC co-chairs on our agenda. We'll take public comment, and as of this time right now, I have 9 people signed up so far. You'll hear a brief public participation update on additional outreach that has happened since our last meeting. And then we'll have the PAC work session, which will include a very brief presentation from David Ungama about mitigation and policies. And then, of course, next steps, and then we'll move on from there. As always, I think I do this each time. I just wanted to remind you of where we are on the big picture in terms of value pricing. We're here early still in 2018, although it is rapidly slipping through our fingers, faster than I would like. And as you can see, the value pricing timeline extends out beyond 2021 plus, so we're still very, very early in the feasibility analysis, and there is a lot that follows on. So just keeping us firmly placed where we are on the timeline. What we hope for from the outcome of this meeting is that the technical team will get from you all really good suggestions, and I shouldn't say really good, I shouldn't qualify them, just suggestions about policy considerations, strategies that might be considered to make value pricing work in this area. They will then take your input back, work with it, and use it to help build customized packages. So, as I said, we'll have these small group discussions which will allow you to do that. In your packet, both that was in front of you at your table, and then there's some more things on the table, but in your packet you should have today's agenda, the PAC 3 meeting summary, which we'll get to in a moment, an outreach report that in particular covers a lot of environmental justice outreach that has recently been conducted, a policy memo. So this is some background information that may help you in today's discussions. The Cambridge report, a primer from the Federal Highway Authority, and a flyer about the upcoming open houses, as another round of open houses is starting very soon, I think. Tomorrow, yeah, that's pretty soon, yeah. We did have a few members who weren't able to join us today. Marie Dodds does have a representative here in the audience, paying attention for her, I hope. Looking, yep, that back there, okay, thank you. And Matt Hoffman sent his regrets this morning, he was ill. And Vivian Satterfield also had travel that she could not avoid. In your packet, near your packet, you should also have a letter from Vivian that she sent with her thoughts about things that could be included in the conversation today. So I think that would be another important piece for you to look at as you have your conversations. So at that point, with that, I would like to hand it over to your co-chairs for their comments, as always. Whichever one wants to go first. Always the question.
I'll kick us off, since Commissioner O'Halloran seems to be a little busy. But thank you all for being here.
I yield to my esteemed colleague.
Thank you all for being here. Looks like we're pretty much about to be crossing the halfway point. So exciting times, and given from the amount of information and letters and interest that have come in as of late, and inquiries regarding this, I think today is going to be a very impactful meeting and very beneficial to myself and my colleague Commissioner O'Halloran as we look to ways to try to make a more palatable option and request as we make our submittal to federal highways. I'm very adamant about making sure that we leave everything on the table and everybody not bite their tongues, as I think this is going to be a very fruitful discussion today, and I like the idea of us breaking out in these work groups. I think it's going to enable us to be a lot more efficient in terms of coming to recommendations as we move forward. So again, thank you all for being here, and I will pass it off to my esteemed colleague.
I have nothing more profound to add to your comments, sir.
All right, thank you very much to both of you. And I appreciate the brevity, as we do have at this point 10 people signed up for public comment. So at this point we will move to public comment. I'll come back to that slide here in just a moment. As always, our observers are welcome to provide comment to members of the PAC. Your comments or questions will not be responded to, although they will certainly be very carefully listened to. As we have 10 people and people still filtering in, I'm going to ask you to hold your comments to 90 seconds if you can, and we will get through our 10 and then see if we have any additional members join us. The first commenters that I have, if you'll please make your way to the microphone, Paul Edgar, followed by Ron Zarin, and then John Leigh.
See if that made a difference.
I think that does it. Good afternoon. My name is Paul Edgar. I'm a young 78-year-old who has spent a lot of, grew up here. I'm very concerned about diversion that will occur, and I just think we need to get our priorities right when it comes to what's happening. I participated a long time ago on the Columbia River crossing. I was up close and personal. And we looked at what the impacts would be of tolling on the I-5 corridor. And it was going to be chaos. But I'm a business guy. I spent most of my life in supply chain management, in creating systems that allowed businesses to make money. If we put together a tolling system, value pricing, that inhibits the ability for us to make money, to do business, we're going to, it's a lose-lose. Most of the constituents that I've talked to have told me that they would rather pay a higher gasoline tax, they would have anything other than tolling as an option. So we need to create more capacity. We need to create new corridors. I'm not against tolling if it was part of creating a new corridor like a West Side bypass. But we can't just go out there and put a stopper in the road and say, we're going to let the people figure it out. It's like pouring water on a flat sheet. Where does it go? And we can't really determine where it will go and what all the impacts will be. So please, for a systems guy that was a senior systems analyst and likes to see things run, I don't think by putting this together, we're going to see something work and runs efficiently and smartly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Edgar. Ron Zarin, followed by John Leigh, and then Neil Walker.
Hi, Ron Zarin, Portland. I'm going to bring this sign. I'm not planning on bringing this in the future because I don't want to be a pest, and I know there's a lot of meetings, but this really gets my point across very well, what I call the Western Arterial Highway. It's probably the most sensible solution we could have because it's not a big interstate freeway. It's something that could connect existing highways and shorten the vehicle miles traveled and improve a lot of things. And what I've seen on the maps, it even goes close to Metro's West Side Trail. What I think about the tolling, though, is that we have two major factors that are going to outrun the benefits of that could be achieved by tolling. And I agree with some of these benefits like ride sharing and transit use. And I don't really like to drive on the freeway myself that much, but I agree with the alternatives. But the two factors that will kind of outrun that, this projected population growth, they're saying 500,000 in Portland is hard to believe. I did read 700,000 by 2040 for the 7-county area. So that's a lot of people. And they're going to be making decisions on where to live. There will probably a lot trend towards home ownership that may reestablish a lot of the patterns we had in the past. And the other factor, too, is just more freight. As the economy rebounds, we have California and Washington industrialized more, shipping more freight, and we're just in the middle of it. And so even if we got those benefits from tolling, the other things would outrun it. So I agree with needing more capacity, but this is a very economical way to do it.
Thank you,
The
Mr.
traffic jam we have now will just get worse as things increase, so.
Thank you, Mr. Swearin. John Leigh, followed by Neil Walker and Brenda Perry.
John Lee, Camas. Why is the staff, rather than the 25 PAC members, controlling this process? At the end of the last meeting, PAC members were leaving. A staffer says, "We didn't reach a consensus." She then asks, "Did we get enough input to move forward?" You don't see or hear the answer. The meeting ends. Who's in charge? It's not the PAC members. At that meeting, the ODOT staff and consultants recommended narrowing the options down to 4 major choices and 1 minor unlikely choice. None of the 25 PAC members got to vote or rank their preferences for the original 8 options before they were reduced. Why not? Would have been very easy to give each PAC member a 1-page copy of the original 8 options and have the PAC rank them 1 to 8 in order of priority. Their voice and their priorities would have been formally considered. They would have formally known their fellow PAC members' priorities. But no, instead the staff told the PAC members which options were most or least important. At the beginning, a PAC member stated that one of the options not moving forward appeared to have the best possible outcome in reducing traffic congestion. This was option 4, build a new lane in each direction on both I-5 and 205, and only toll those new lanes. But staff didn't include option 4 in those recommended for further study and evaluation. We were told this wasn't advancing due to the astronomical cost, yet when PAC members asked what the cost was so they could use their judgment and also report to their constituents, there was none. No cost estimates were created. Who's in charge? Not the PAC members.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Mr. Lee.
You're welcome. I'll claim my other 90 seconds when I can.
Neil Walker, followed by Brenda Perry and then Russ Axelrod.
Thank you for having me and having this opportunity to speak, Ms. Mabee. I wanted to thank Mr. Simpson for his encouragement to stay involved, also as well as Mayor Ann's directional encouragement. I also had a great collaborating discussion with Mr. Mason, who's a senior planner on value pricing. I'm observing that Clark County leadership as well as Mayor Ann is hungry and thirsty to develop a relationship with ODOT, which I call GODOT, in their leadership assertiveness, and a lot of negativity and denials and suppositions towards who's going to be at a disadvantage for this value pricing. I want to continue to encourage collaboration and leadership with Clark County leaders as well as ODOT and Oregon leadership. I think it will be fruitful in the end when this is all done, and I'm hoping we can get a new I-5 bridge built, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Brenda Perry, followed by Russ Axelrod and Terry Parker.
Come down a bit for me. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Brenda Perry. I'm Council President for West Lynn, and West Lynn sits astride the bottleneck on the 205. And if you want to see what diversion looks like, come into West Lynn at peak hours and you will see what it's already looking like as cars try to get off. We recently got some funding to upgrade the 43, which is very exciting, but also very nerve-wracking, because imagine what's going to happen with our diversion issues when the 43 is tied up with roadworks as we try to improve the road. So it's a major issue for us. We recently did a survey for a bond measure to ask our citizens what their major issues were, and more than 2/3 said transportation and traffic congestion were major issues in West Lynn. And this is now. This is before you even think about tolling the roads. So I would ask that you don't consider doing these or anything close to West Lynn until those lanes are widened, until the 205 is widened and the Abernathy Bridge, because we already have such a major problem here in West Lynn. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Perry. Russ Axelrod, followed by Terry Parker and Les Poole.
Thank you very much. Russ Axelrod, the Mayor of West Lynn, and on behalf of West Lynn, I appreciate ODOT's efforts and all this committee's efforts to address our transportation challenges. You know, West Lynn is quite distraught about the decision last year on leaving out I-205 in the transportation package, because we have a fundamental capacity problem first. The bill itself includes this policy component creating a pathway for looking at value pricing. to address congestion. And my concern is that in this well-intended effort for value pricing, that we may be creating a monster on its own in this program, and in the process be further distracted from the energy and focus we need on a broader transportation strategy for our entire corridor area and the metro region. I think value pricing should be viewed as a tool toward congestion, but this program, as early conceived, won't even be available, as Councilor Perry noted, for another 10 years. And that is assuming the state's going to come out and rebuild our highway even in the next 10 years. So I ask, what are we supposed to do in the next 10 years when we're already in utter gridlock dysfunction and with a super diversion problem in our city? By the time we wait for this program, we're also likely to have maybe 100, 200,000 more people in the metro region. This scenario is just very disturbing. So we need to be developing alternatives so not everyone has to jump in their car whenever they want to do something. We recommend that ODOT and this PAC committee and others working with TriMet Metro and our regional cities, and I note there's not one city represented on the committee, address a broader transportation strategy. This should include, for example, a circular light rail system, other measures to address crosstown traffic and the need for circulation in our metro region, and not so just Portland in and out centric. We need to build a better framework for our region to address more than simply congestion, a system to help our communities connect and become more vibrant internally, and to address quality of life issues that are severely threatened by our basic transportation needs. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Axelrod. Terry Parker, followed by Les Poole, and then Douglas Allen.
Thank you. I'm Terry Parker, a resident of Northeast Portland. It appears daily working class and commuting drivers do not have representative seats at the table on this committee. With seats for the alternatives, equity is absent. Any tolling through Portland will likely add more congestion on city thoroughfares, which in turn could add more cut-through traffic on neighborhood streets. New through lanes need to be added as opposed to taking away existing freeway lanes and tolling them. The HOV lanes on I-5 are an example of adding restrictions to an existing lane that in turn adds congestion to the adjacent lanes. Parallel non-tolled routes must be upgraded, easily accessed, and clearly marked with signage. Because there are too few bridges between Portland and Vancouver, with only the two existing bridges on the interstates, the existing bridges must remain toll-free. If tolling occurs anywhere in the Portland area, it must be contingent on fixing the I-5 bottleneck. Any money derived from tolling must be utilized to increase motor vehicle capacity, not extorted or to fund or subsidize alternative infrastructure. If bicycle lanes and special infrastructure are considered to have value, a way must be found to establish equity whereby bicyclists pay user fees for all the special infrastructure and priority treatment they continually receive. If drivers already pay since drivers already pay gas taxes and other fees for roads in addition to subsidizing alternative modes, any additional fee assessed, such as tolling, is simply an inequitable money grab. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Les Poole, followed by Douglas Allen, and then Jim Zarin.
Les Poole, I live in Clackamas County, and I'm real active in planning and transportation. Got a background in material handling. That means I know how things move. I noticed I got a little response from the lady from the Truckers Association. Thank you. It's hard in 90 seconds to say what needs to be said, but I go back to the original legislation in Salem. We started with an $8 billion bill. It was whittled down to a $5 billion bill. Senate, and I testified there, and one of my biggest concerns was the prioritization issues. And what we heard in Clackamas County and elsewhere was that, well, we'll put aside money for a study for tolling, and we'll look at getting those lanes on 205. There is nowhere in this area that has more potential for an ongoing bottleneck than 205 at Stafford. Metro recently included Stafford in the urban reserves. The growth out there is just exploding, and those that have any question about how bad it's getting and how desperately we need to fix that capacity need to come out and park on the Stafford overpass like I have at 5 o'clock. It's really, really easy to stand there and watch what's going on. We are killing commerce. We are discussing the equity of tolling. And at the same time, where has the authorization for tolling come from? I'm wondering how we got from the legislative bill in 2017 to here. It just seems like we've got a foregone conclusion here, and there isn't any discussion of equity or the advantages or how sweet it's going to be told without having to stop at a booth. All of those are nice things to hear, but the core issue is that we have a desperate need here that is not being addressed by this.
Thank you, Mr. Poole. Douglas Allen, followed by Jim Zarin.
Good afternoon. I apologize for testifying at 2 meetings in a row, but after carefully listening to the technical information presented at your last meeting and listening to the comments of the committee, I'm really surprised that there isn't an additional option on the table, and that's the option of tolling all of the Portland area freeways, including 84, 26, 217, 405, et cetera. And there are 4 excellent reasons why I'd ask the committee to see if you can't get that additional option put on the table. First, it would have the lowest price per vehicle. Second, as the consultant said, it is the most equitable. Third, of anything conceivable at affordable cost, it has the greatest potential for reducing congestion and improving commute times of anything available. And the 4th reason is that it's explicitly authorized by HB 2017, so I would encourage the committee to look into getting that additional option on the table for serious consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Jim Zarin.
Jim Zarin from a group called SERI, Smart Equitable Approaches to Regional Issues. I thought I signed in, but apparently I signed in to speak, so as long as I got the opportunity. I guess I want to point out that I don't think I've heard anybody that spoke today talk about demand management. I think they're all talking about supply, right? They're all talking about increasing capacity of the system as more and more people come and as our economy is in peril. It seems to me the legislature made a decision on tolling. It's not your job to decide whether it's a good idea. And so you're doing the best you can to figure out how to implement it, which I think is your job. So I just encourage you to keep doing it and not be swayed by people who should have been down at the legislature saying tolling's the wrong answer. That's where they should have made that argument. Well, all due respect to my fellow citizens out here. And I really do encourage you to think about what we're trying to do, which is control the demand for highway lanes, and to think about this being another alternative in addition to more transit. So I encourage you to do the good work you're doing and stay the course and don't be swayed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zarin. Thank you for those of you who have made your comments. Is there anyone else signed up for public comment out there? No?
Right
okay,
here.
Great.
One more. Me.
Have you?
Mouse.
Okay, can you sign in afterwards?
Sure.
Sure, okay.
I thought I signed in to begin with.
Okay.
Maybe we signed different things.
Yeah, it could be. Well, you never know. Anytime you're dealing with public, sometimes you deal with confusion. My name is Frank Mounts, ounce with an M in front of it. I'm kind of new out here. I moved out here a little over 3 years ago. I moved from the middle part of the country, Missouri, where I dealt with a lot of the same circumstances you're dealing with here. I'm glad to see that the Federal Highway Department's here. I'm glad to see the trucking is represented, because I think everybody needs to have an input. I drive the I-5 corridor every day. I live in Tigard. I work in Vancouver. I work in the fine city of Vancouver, where this lady is control of now. Thank God. So I think the biggest thing is Band-Aids never fix anything. This tolling, pricing, congestion idea will never fix anything. And all it's going to do is push the traffic, like everybody has said, to the out city streets, which are already congested. City of Portland alone has accidents every day. You listen to them on the news. People get hurt, killed, maimed, run over because of traffic on city streets where they shouldn't be. Everybody's in a hurry. Everybody has a place to go. You need another bridge. You need another corridor. The trucking industry, I'm quite sure, is panicking over everything. They don't want to be paying more money. They already pay more taxes than anybody else. But here's the thing. If you don't put another huge highway to the west side and put another bridge across the entire factor, you're never going to get ahead. Also, with the federal government involved, I believe it can be done in less than 5 years. This 10-year idea, you guys have no vision. You need to quit living in the past. Live for the future. Have a vision.
Thank you, Mr. Mounts.
Thank you.
Anyone else who did not get signed up that would wish to make public comment? Go ahead, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Canary, and I just thought someone should be here to say that I think this is an awesome idea. I think congestion pricing is great. I think you guys are following the mandate of the legislature. We have something called induced demand, which means that if you build more lanes, more cars are just going to fill those lanes. So, I mean, I would love to see someone go out there tonight, paint some blue lines down I-5 and just make it a transit corridor. I think we could do it very quickly, and you guys are doing a great job. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Canary. And last call, anyone else wish to make public comment? Are you raising your hand to comment? No, okay. All right, thank you very much. I did want to point out that as we don't have time for lengthy comments, we appreciate those of you who do comment, keeping your time short. You can add your additional comments on public comment forms that are available out in the front. You can email your comments to Value Pricing PAC, which will go directly to the advisory committee at odot.state.or.us, and I'm sure that's on materials out front. And also, there is live right now another website that you can find, and the folks out front can give you information about that, where it is open for public comment right now on the online open house, so you can visit that. As well as I mentioned earlier, there's upcoming in-person open house meetings starting tomorrow. So there are many, many ways for you to also get your comments. And if you send the comments to that PAC email, Value Pricing PAC, at odot.state.or.us, those get delivered directly to all the members of the PAC. So there are multiple ways to get your comments through to the PAC. So thank you very much for all of your input. We really appreciate it. I did say that we would return to the summary from PAC meeting number 3. All the members of the PAC did receive that in the packet that was mailed to you, and we would like to make it final. Does anyone have any concerns or edits or thoughts about the last summary from meeting number 3? Any objections to us making that final? Objection? Yes, Paul.
I just want to comment that one of the earlier speakers, I think, characterized the last meeting pretty well, as far as, you know, what some of the discussion and directives were, or not directives were, really lack of directives were, that it seems as though the where we're just steamrolling ahead, and I think some of the comments made towards the last meeting don't seem to be recognized in the process. So I just want to acknowledge that the minutes really don't reflect that comment or that concern, and so with but I'm not going to. I'm not asking for any edits to the minutes, but I just want to get on record that I think Mr. Leigh's comments earlier today were pretty well spot on.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Anyone else, any other thoughts about PAC meeting number 3 summary? With nothing else, then we will go ahead and make that final. I did want to return to one slide that I skipped over too quickly. As I said earlier, this meeting is sort of the beginning of you starting to develop your recommendations, and so we thought it would be useful to show you what's upcoming. So today, at today's meeting, as we said, we'll be having a discussion about strategies and policies, with the hope that you will identify some benefits and strategies to address impacts that the technical team can then look at. At PAC 5, which is next month, May 14, you will be looking at the analysis of the round 2 concept studies, and starting to develop what you want to think about for draft recommended concept or concepts. And then the final PAC meeting, June 6th, is refining your recommendations, and this will be where you will be weighing in on what it is you would like to present to the Oregon Transportation Commission at their meeting on July 12th, looking at things like location, types of value pricing, mitigation strategies, and so forth. So wrapping it all up together on Pack 6. So just kind of this is the way we are looking at moving ahead over the next 3 meetings to develop your recommendations. With that, we would like to invite 2 people up to give you a brief presentation, and this is just kind of an update, really, if you will. April DeLeon Galloway from Oregon Department of Transportation and Alex Cousins, a colleague of mine from Enviro Issues, will be providing you an update on the outreach process. This is a very short agenda item, so while they have a wealth of information, you have a report in your packet that they are going to be speaking to, and they'll also be available to you as you go into your smaller group sessions if you have specific questions about things. So if we can keep the questions to a minimum, that would be great. So we'll have more time for your discussions.
Alrighty, thanks. Hi, can you hear me? Good afternoon. I'm April DeLeon Galloway. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Value Pricing Team here at ODOT. So really excited to talk to you guys about what we heard in March and the engagement that we had. As well, to speak with us is our colleague and friend, Mr. Alex Cousins, with a consultant team, Enviro Issues. So we're, just a quick update on our engagement numbers, if you want to take a look at the next slide here. Public participation to date, since we last spoke, some of our numbers have changed. Let me move this over just a little. 3,500 views of our overview video it definitely increased there, as well as our completed questionnaires, about 2,100 plus so far, and altogether about 1,200 emails and voicemails that have been processed by our team. So definitely a high level of interest from the region. So let's move on to the next slide. What we did in March. So we embarked on a really strong effort to hear from various communities that don't typically participate in traditional public meeting processes. So our goal here was to just ensure that a broad cross-section of community voices are heard and included in the analysis. So let's talk a little bit, I think, about our approach to engagement of Title VI and environmental justice communities. Our work was guided by early stakeholder interviews. We held 6 stakeholder interviews with various local advocacy groups. And those groups, those individuals informed us, I think, on an engagement process moving forward with environmental justice communities. So the feedback we heard, among a few other points, was that we needed to have an authentic process, an early engagement of these communities. Additionally, in our winter engagement, we found that after analyzing public input and data, that many communities in Title VI environmental justice communities were underrepresented in the public input. So we wanted a way to really broaden our reach for the month of March and in our engagement. What we did also is we were guided as well by best practices in our engagement approach. It's a strategy that we have employed in some of our other projects that worked really well, and that's to retain community engagement liaisons. They're like community organizers, and they were able to reach out to their networks and bring people to discussion groups. We held 6 2-hour discussion groups in March, and they were with these representatives from these communities: Vietnamese, Slavic, Hispanic, Chinese, African American, and Native American. All of these groups were held in native languages, with the exception of the last 2, and they were interpreted in real time by the community engagement liaisons. Also, we hosted 114 participants. If you'll notice, 3/4 of the participants did self-identify as low-income individuals. Additionally, we also hosted a few families that had disabled individuals in their families, so they were able to provide that perspective as well. 286 completed questionnaires. Our community engagement liaisons distributed questionnaires as well to their network for an even broader reach, and these were great. We did see participation in our in-person events from all 4 counties: Multnomah, Washington, Clark, and Clackamas. And with these questionnaires, the distribution of these questionnaires, we got an even broader reach. So we did really get a lot of feedback from all over the region on these. And a full report has been provided to the committee prior to this meeting for the March engagement. So if you take a look at that, you can look at some of the other data that we collected. So we can move on to, oh, you got it up, thank you. What we heard November to February. So this is maybe backtracking just a tiny bit, but it's really important because it's consistent with the feedback that we heard in March. There are several points that we heard loud and clear from the community, and we wanted to just kind of let you know, first of all, what some of the consistent themes are from the public input, and then Alex is going to talk to you guys about some distinctions, some other kind of a little bit different things we heard in March from our environmental justice and Title VI discussion groups. So, you know, first point that came out kind of was echoed loud and clear throughout the community is that congestion certainly is a problem, and it needs to be addressed. Pressures of population growth really are putting a strain on the current infrastructure. Questions remain about the effectiveness of congestion pricing. Many individuals expressed skepticism that it would work, as well as concerns about disproportionate impacts and overall affordability of the tolls for low-income families. So that was, those are some pretty large themes there. I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Mr. Alex Cousins, who was instrumental in organizing and facilitating our March discussion groups. So he's going to talk about some of the distinctions we heard in this round of engagement. Alex?
Thank you, April. So as April just said, a lot of rich information in your packets from the summary of all of this outreach we did, so I encourage you to read that if you haven't had that opportunity yet. And this includes a blend of the feedback we received from in-person conversations as well as the surveys, so we kind of incorporated that into rolled up themes. And I'm going to be drawing here on the distinctions that we heard from the Title VI Environmental Justice Community group members that we met with. First of all, there's a stronger reliance on I-5 and I-205 for community members we met with. Over half of the participants use these freeways as their primary commute to work or to school, and that's especially true for I-205 for low-income populations on the east side of the Portland metro area. This is also consistent with the results of our winter outreach questionnaire, where we had higher degrees of people identified as persons of color indicated they use these freeways more heavily than white respondents did in that survey. This could indicate less flexibility for lower income and diverse populations, assuming workers and students have set times where and days where they need a predictable arrival time. And arriving late for appointments or for work was the most impact experienced by these groups. The second point I'd like to make is that the housing crisis locally, of which we're all aware, is really taking its toll for these populations. Rising housing prices and gentrification are pushing low-income people further away from the city center, and this is increasing their travel times to work and school. Many people we heard from really did understand the connection between housing affordability and transportation choices, and we heard loud and clear that they felt that they would be the ones shouldering more of the financial burden associated with tolling because they're already being forced to commute from further out. There was also a higher degree of skepticism about value pricing as a congestion management tool. That we got a lot of pushback on how it really would work and would it really be effective. Folks were more inclined to believe that there was a revenue generation focus of this idea more so than congestion relief. Many people told us they thought that tolling would actually make congestion worse because it would force more drivers into already congested but untolled lanes. And as with our winter engagement, the price of the user fee, the price of the toll really was the biggest question they had about whether it would influence their behavior. There was more uncertainty about how tolling might impact them and affect their choices, more uncertainty about how they would respond to the impacts. Participants expressed a really clear preference for choice. So the priced lane options were more popular than priced roadway. Very little support for priced roadways, but a lot of support for priced lanes because they like having an option available to not have to pay a toll if they didn't need to. And similarly, tolling during peak travel hours only was preferred over tolling 24 hours a day. A lot of the folks we spoke with didn't necessarily commute during peak hour. As you would expect, there was more sensitivity to the financial burden of paying tolls. Many participants had questions and concerns about how tolling would impact their household income and their families. A few people told us they thought that tolling was another form of classism that favors wealthier drivers who can afford to pay a toll over lower income people with fewer means. And for many people, just the idea of paying a toll was unaffordable to them no matter what the toll would be set at. And finally, there was less flexibility about the ability for folks to change their travel time or their mode or their route of travel. They were less likely to be influenced by the availability or convenience of transit options and indicated less flexibility on when they thought they could leave the house for work or for school. This suggests these participants are challenged by limited access to transit where they live and limited flexibility in the time of day they can travel. We asked at the discussion groups, how many of you in the room right now use transit? And asked for a show of hands, and at many of the meetings, no one raised their hand, and at some of the meetings, just a few people raised their hand. So, and similarly, no one indicated that they bike or walk to their jobs, because it's just not seen as a viable option for folks that are living further away from the city center and from employment centers. You know, it's different from the feedback we heard over the winter where we asked those same questions, and higher degrees of people said they'd be more likely to consider changing the time of day they left their house, or they might consider taking transit. There were higher proportions of the general population indicated they might do that compared to the folks we spoke with in March. So that's a really high-level overview of the takeaways from those conversations. As April mentioned, we're about to engage in our next round of outreach this month. It's going to be very similar to what we did back in January, where we have open houses and an online open house, and that information is all in your packets. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Penny. April and I will be available to you as a resource on the Title VI environmental justice engagement for the remainder of your meeting if you have additional questions.
Thank you to both of you. Anything from the PAC members that you just have to have clarified before we move on? Well, yes, go ahead.
I'd just like to know if we have access to the questionnaires.
Yes,
are they in our packets?
The questionnaires are if they're not in your packet, they're in the appendices, which are online. It's a pretty big document, so I think we gave you the summary. The appendices has the questionnaire.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Penny, I'd just like to thank Judith Grafe and her team for coming and making 3 community presentations to Clark County, the City of Vancouver, and Regional Transportation Council, and we are looking forward to another open house before our May event.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that on behalf of Judith. Judith, did you want to say anything?
Actually, yeah, on the last slide, we'll be updating our flyers, but we are right now scheduling that 5th open house, and so it's not on the current flyer, but for April 30th, that will be a Monday night.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, both of you. Appreciate it. And don't go far. We may have questions for you. So we're going to move into what we call the workshop portion of this meeting now. And as I said, the way it's going to work is at each table you're going to have small group discussions before we set you free on that. And I give you some guidance on how to do those discussions, because we're not going to just let you talk about the weather or the Mariners or the Seahawks, but we will have some guidance for you. We wanted to start off by letting David Ungama from WSP help you learn a little bit about what policies other areas in the U.S. have implemented for mitigating impacts, because that's what today is all about, is talking about impacts. There is some note paper in front of you on your desk. As David goes over some things, you might want to jot some notes down, because these are the kinds of things that we're hoping to give you as fodder for your discussions as you think about different impacts. So with that teaser, I will turn it over to David.
Great. Thank you, Penny. I'd like to also acknowledge Trey Baker, whom you may recall from the first PAC meeting, giving an overview of congestion pricing. He and I will be resources throughout the work session, so if there's at any point that we can help out in terms of identifying what other communities have done, if there are other options that could be considered as we address different policy types of activities, we're both delighted to address questions throughout the work session. But as Penny had mentioned, really what we wanted to do is just set up some of the initial seeds of thought for how to address a variety of different policy components for congestion pricing applications and what those pricing applications could look like when realized as applied. So for this part of it, going back to our charter, which is looking at what are some of the mitigation efforts that need to be done for an income equity and environmental justice perspective. So what we talk about in terms of value pricing impacts and the ability to mitigate for that really pertain to specific concerns that are expressed under federal law. That's primarily given through Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It also has been codified by separate executive orders as well over time. And really what it pertains to is equity as it applies to both income in terms of ethnicity and other type of racial considerations, as well as national origin. These types of considerations are important from a transportation perspective because it does affect quality of life and overall equity of communities beyond just simply the interface with the transportation system. So when we start thinking about transportation and how it would be impacted by value pricing, we also have to consider what are those equity impacts. Primarily, do those impacts have a corresponding level of benefit for those communities whom they are impacted by? There are questions that pertain not only just to the pricing application, but overall the level of equity of the transportation system itself. There are existing constraints on our system. There are existing constraints on the network. And it is very much in tune with constraints of how we, as an entire society, interact with our transportation system. A couple of PACs ago, you may recall that I gave an analogy as to why we look at congestion pricing for transportation management purposes. And it could be really the analogy is in terms of how we all got into this room. We all walked through those doors. We all got to our seats. We didn't crowd each other out. We didn't bump at each other. We didn't hit each other in the head. But if I told everyone, let's leave right now all together, and we went out through those doors, we would not make it all out. We would have problems getting through that door because we weren't organized. Pricing is an organization, but it also recognizes that there are constraints that that organization is to be applied upon. So when we start thinking about those constraints in our society, what we're really looking at are some of the different aspects that pertain to equity. It's not just about the price that's being paid by a particular community. It's also about what are some of the other aspects that affect that community as well. There are existing inequities within society, and there are existing inequities within our transportation system. And there are also differences in terms of how we interface with our transportation funding system and overall levels of taxation. Oregon has income tax but no sales tax. Washington has sales tax but no income tax. You could say that a Washington resident, for example, may benefit from buying goods and services in Oregon and not having to pay sales tax and then going back. Or you could look at it in a different way, that if you work in Oregon and reside in Washington, you're paying income tax in Oregon, but you're a resident of Washington. These are aspects of taxation and fund that affect individual communities, and value pricing will be another one of those considerations that need to be considered as part of the larger package. How does it affect individual communities, and how does it affect individuals? So when we start thinking about some of these different aspects, we're really looking at how different components of value pricing would affect the overall transportation system and our community's place within that transportation system. Your challenge, at least as I would suggest to you, is over the next hour and a half or so that we are conducting this workshop, is to be creative. To think about whatever potential impacts value pricing could have, and if those impacts are greater than the perceived potential benefit for those communities, to be creative about how can we mitigate issues. How can we provide for different policies that may influence how the concepts are applied, and then ultimately lead to some sort of project implementation. You may recall, I've talked about this a few times over the past couple of PAC meetings, that what we're looking at is taking concepts, applying different policies to those concepts, and ultimately yielding projects. And in this feasibility assessment, in what we are working around today and over the next few months, is really primarily confined to the concepts part of this development. We're not talking about projects yet, but through today's activities, we're starting to address, at least nudge a little bit, the policies that not only influence the concepts today, but also can reiterate back into the concepts, allow them to be refined as we start thinking about different policies to be addressed. Again, be creative. We're here to help. We'd like to identify how other states have applied these types of pricing applications, how they have addressed different policy options to address and mitigate impacts, how to extend benefits to communities that may not have been benefited in the past by transportation decisions. All of these types of issues really require creativity that reflect local context, that really understand the communities here in the Portland area. So what are some of those different applications that states have looked at? Well, in terms of value pricing, many states have applied value pricing in different ways. In certain situations, it's through the provision of new capacity. In other situations, it's through the conversion of HOV lanes and the like. But they all have had to address this issue of who pays, how do they pay, and what are they benefiting from it. So some of the first aspects that we could look at is how do you utilize different incentives and discounts as a way of addressing potential impacts. So the very first one, and the one that's used most commonly around the country, is providing either discounted or free use of the priced facilities by carpoolers. If you take on more than one, or in certain cases more than two people in your vehicle, you get a free use of the facility, of the priced facility, or potentially a discounted payment. Now, it's not true for all priced facilities. There are some that don't offer a carpool discount, but some have. And certainly most of the express lanes that have been applied have utilized this. Some of the concerns over time have been violations of carpool rates. I mean, you can do a search on Google and you'll find a lot of news stories about people using blow-up dolls and large pets as ways of making for occupancy. But those are few and far between. Technology is also helping us out over time as well. Think about the airbag sensor in your car. That is in and of itself an occupancy detection in your vehicle. The second is subsidized toll rates. So a few communities have had a priced corridor go through a low-income community, and so one of the concerns that has been addressed is how does this disproportionately impact low-income communities? And part of the response is, well, let's provide a subsidized toll rate for that community. So that can be, for example, on the Los Angeles I-10 and 110 corridor. There they provide subsidized toll rates for the use of the express lines by members of the community. You can even look to TriMet's efforts right now for having a discounted access to fare payments. TriMet's activities has a documentation process. You can think of any type of discounted use of express lanes in a similar context. Besides having discounted toll rates, you could also look at it from the reverse perspective of giving toll credits. That would mean that if you have certain types of activities, those credits increase and go into an account for individuals that they can then utilize the price facility for free or for certain types of trips. Again, in Los Angeles on the I-10 and 110 corridors, if you utilize transit in these corridors, you have credits that are accumulated into your toll account. So each time you ride the bus, you're getting a little bit of an incremental step towards having free toll use of the toll facilities. That's one possibility. Another is from a geographic perspective, a locational perspective. So in Fort Worth, there's the Chisholm Trail Tollway under development, and as part of the policy design there, was concerned about a community that could only access the freeway by utilizing the tollway. So they actually provide local toll credits for the residents of that community so that way they have access to the tollway without having to pay for it, as they did not have an option to do so otherwise. Absent types of incentives and discounts, we can look at other types of investments that can help address issues of providing different options for people to travel. Ultimately, for value pricing to be successful, there has to be enough options for an individual's trip for it to matter. That means either options from a modal perspective, being able to have access to transit, access to carpools, access to van pools, bicycling, that's fine. It could also mean options relating to travel times, taking a trip 5 minutes later, 5 minutes before. It could have choices relative to individual lanes of travel within a corridor. It could also mean different choices relative to your value of time. One of the more important ones that other communities have addressed is providing enough multimodal investment to go concurrent with the value pricing program so that there are enough modal options that are available. What you see here is an inline transit station that was built on the I-35W express lanes in Minneapolis. And this was done so that bus service would have a very high speed level of travel in the express lanes, and that provides for an enhanced level of service and helps encourage more people to travel by bus as well as by the priced express lanes. Other communities have done similar types of transit investments within their corridors, and that's where we have seen a lot of improvement. Even in facilities that haven't built an express lane and just gone to a toll facility, such as SR 520 in the Seattle-Bellevue region in Washington State, they also increase the level of bus service to go concurrent with the pricing program to encourage greater levels of transit utilization in those corridors. One other one I should also highlight, it's actually not on the slide here, but I know that there was an interest, someone mentioned it, bicycling. The US 36 express lanes actually part of the package that was built required not only the construction of an express lane system, but it also required the construction of a continuous bicycle lane facility between the cities of Boulder and Denver, which is about 30 miles in length. And that, I can tell you, is very well utilized. In terms of other types of ways of looking at pricing, one of the issues that have come up in the research for income equity is the equity of access to the price facilities. Do you have the very basics from a financial perspective in order to participate in it? Put differently, it is a common practice for value price facilities to utilize electronic transponders in vehicles. These are devices that communicate with the infrastructure in the corridors to collect tolls. There is no cash toll collection. There is no throwing coins in a basket anymore. It is all done electronically. One of the concerns as expressed in literature is if you do not have access to a credit card or you do not have access to a checking account or a savings account, you are what's known as an unbanked household or an unbanked individual. And if you don't have access to those, it becomes a little bit more difficult to get a transponder. So part of what other communities have done to address that specific income issue is to provide for cash-based transponders so that you can purchase a sticker-based transponder in your vehicle. The transponders themselves are very inexpensive to the government agency. Can be less than 50 cents each, and you can acquire that through a cash payment. And it's having almost like a debit account, but it's all debit-based upon a cash payment. In other states, that's often been done at grocery stores, gas stations. Those are the vendors of those transponder systems on a cash basis. Another issue is in terms of how you look at the toll collection itself. License plate tolling, which is utilized in Washington, Colorado, and a few other locations, is a way of trying to take out the requirement for a transponder but still having the benefits of electronic toll collection. This one is a little different because now the cost is more incurred by the toll operator because there are additional expenses relating to validating images, making sure that the right vehicle owner is charged and an invoice is sent out, a little bit of collection, costs associated with that as well. These are all pros and cons, but certainly ways of addressing access to and from the facility. And then finally, the last one here, before we turn it over to you to be as creative as possible, is issues of traffic diversion. So, as I mentioned before, one of the options. Penny, do you? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So, in terms of freights, yes. So, access. Many express lane corridors do not allow for access to for trucks to utilize express lanes, but others expressly do, and they provide for access to the lanes, but they do it at a surcharge as well. There are ways of trying to encourage or discourage the use of freight on those price facilities and through an access perspective. It's a little bit different from the context of income equity, but there is an impact down the line in terms of how freight access around a community impacts overall economic competitiveness. And then, so traffic diversion, again, in addition to multimodal level of investments, and we talked a little bit about transit investments that go concurrent with it, it's also addressing issues of impacts to localized street networks and surface streets in a way that also reflects the transportation system. One of the benefits of value pricing is it does recapture capacity that's lost when you are in saturated traffic conditions. When traffic congestion is bogged down, your freeway facility is no longer carrying its maximum capacity, it's carrying half of it. So value pricing, in a way, helps increase the level of functional capacity during congested times. But in order, again, to be successful, there has to be options for all travelers. And one of the concerns is, how will that affect parallel routes? How will that affect different ways for people to get to and from? It won't take very long for Waze or Google Maps, for example, to route you in different ways around congested areas. It's also potential that at some point in the future, it also route you around priced alternatives. So when it comes to that, what are different ways of addressing it? First and foremost is looking at your surface streets network and having levels of improvement on the surface streets to apply to any particular problems that could occur, all within the corridor. Other options are advanced traffic management strategies that can be utilized to enhance the level of flow on the facilities and minimize the reliance upon pricing for demand management, but rather to enhance the effectiveness of pricing for demand management concurrent with flow management technologies. Making our freeway system smarter, but also allowing for demand management at the same time certainly does extend the maintenance of that freeway corridor over the long term. These are complementary strategies for either surface streets, traffic calming, advanced traffic management strategies, and the like that could be beneficial to the transportation system as we develop a value pricing strategy. So I think that by and large, these are just some seeds for thought in terms of ideas as to how to mitigate problems. Certainly, Alex and April had identified many of the issues that need to be addressed from a lower income community's perspective. There are also a lot of other issues that you may come up with, and I think now's the time to start thinking about these so that they can be put back into the concepts and developed so that when this comes back to you at the 5th and 6th PAC meetings, you're seeing a robust series of recommendations based upon your input. Penny?
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. Any urgent questions for David that you must have answered before you engage in any conversations? Yes, go ahead.
I guess just one, maybe I'll address this, but as we're having our conversations, are you looking for us to be at all constrained in the strategies that we're coming up with in terms of what's legally doable, what's constitutionally allowed, what's practically achievable, or are you just looking for ideas?
It's a really good question, and we're primarily looking for ideas, recognizing constitutional issues. If you identify something like that, and I'm going to go over this worksheet, there would be a place where you would have to address that and say, we recognize it would take a pretty major change, but you can certainly address some, suggest something like that. Great question. Any others before I explain what we're going to be doing? Yes.
So maybe the worksheet will explain that, but I just want to make it perfectly clear. I think the situation is going to be different from milepost marker to milepost marker.
Certainly.
Okay? And also, it's going to be different for whatever strategy that is, whether it's price lanes or price roadways. So how are we going to be able to differentiate our work to make sure that it's location specific and it's also from that alternatives, those price roadway versus price lane?
Let me explain the worksheet. I think that will help you. And at this time, if I could ask the table facilitators, come on up and take your places at your tables, because you're all going to have some help. So you don't have to struggle at each of you at your tables on your own. The facilitators will have a worksheet that looks very much like this, and your job, in its simplest terms, is to help fill out at least 3 worksheets, because what you're going to be focusing on is what we're calling issues or impacts. And as you've heard both today and at the previous PAC meeting as a result of the outreach, there are a number of issues that have come up repeatedly. You heard them again today. They are listed on the left-hand side of the worksheet, and they have to do with disproportionate impacts on people with low incomes or otherwise disadvantaged groups, effectiveness of pricing, local diversion due to price lanes or price-free roadways, the confusion for people to understand how to maneuver through a priced facility, lack of other options, as David mentioned, lack of alternate transportation options, how will the revenue be used? So those are some very frequent issues that have been heard. There are others that I'm sure that you've heard. What we're going to ask you to do is to focus as a group on, first you have to pick one issue. And it can be any one of those that are on the worksheet or any others that one of you may want to propose to your group. Let's think about this issue. And then you're going to talk about that issue and think about what tools, what strategies, what policies might help mitigate or respond to that issue. And then, Paul, as you said, what we'll note is that there may be considerations for that. As Bernie said, maybe it's a constitutional issue. As Paul said, maybe it's a location-specific issue. We'll ask you to make a note of those kinds of considerations when you have that conversation. Maybe you're talking about this issue only along 5 miles from point A to point B. Let's note that as you talk about that strategy and make a note of that consideration on the worksheet. And you guys don't even have to do the worksheets. Your facilitators will be filling them out for you. So they're going to be listening carefully for that and asking you prompting questions to make sure they complete them. And there's also a place for you to identify, does this apply to one concept of the 5? Does it apply to 2? Does it apply to all of them? So again, that helps with some of that specificity. So let me walk you through an example. So if the facilitators could each hold up the worksheet in front of them so your members can see them. My example is, and I'm supposed to flip chart this, but I think I'm just going to walk you through it in the interest of time, is the table that I'm working with decided that they wanted to talk about the fact that some communities and locations don't have another option to driving on the freeway. So we've heard in some locations in the Portland metro region that there's not enough transit options, okay? And the additional information was, we've heard that there isn't enough transit in some areas to make it a viable option. My community only has 1 or 2 buses during rush hour. So that's the issue you as a group decided to talk about. And as a group, you said, well, we looked at one of the pieces of information that's on your table as a resource. We looked at the list of example strategies that you all have. It's just a recap primarily of what David told you. So I noticed you weren't all scribbling madly, so we did it for you. There's a whole list of strategies you can pull from. And then if you're also curious about where things are, what you know or don't know, there's another piece that's called Round 2 Concepts. What do we know now? And so there's some information about the concepts which can help you understand a little bit more and get more specific with your thoughts. So 2 very important pieces that are on your table for resources. So using those pieces as a group, my group said, we want to focus on 2 strategies. One is that we need to increase transit services in the areas where the freeway will be tolled. So that's one of the strategies that we think needs to be put in with this concept. And also we think there should be incentives, either discounts or free, we don't know which, for carpools in the price lane. So those are the 2 strategies that we think should go along with this concern that there isn't enough transit in some areas. Some considerations, some thoughts that we have about this, some things that we might need to look at a little harder in the future is we may need to find some additional funding for significant changes in transit service. We may also really need to look deep into how much can be given in discounts or subsidies without impacting the effectiveness of tolling. So what are those trade-offs in terms of, if we give too much in terms of discounts, are we shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of the benefits of tolling? So those are some considerations that go along with these potential strategies. And my group thought that this applied specifically to Concept A, the northern I-5 priced lanes. But it could be, another group would say it applies to all concepts. So again, that's very specific to your group. So this is an example of a completed worksheet. That would be one issue that would be worked through, and then your facilitator would say, great, thank you. Put that off to the side, pick up another blank one, and say, okay, what's the next issue you want to talk about? And we would like you to at least tackle 3 of these issues. And we think we'll get some very interesting feedback. This is, again, where David urges you to be very creative. And also provide some specificity if you, as you think about these, if you're providing some insight from your perspective or a particular regional or a specific location, let's make sure we capture that. So does that make sense, what we're asking you to do? Just, yes?
If we say, Craig has this great idea, if you need more information, can we put down a person's name for additional outreach information?
Absolutely. Yeah. The more information, the better. Yeah, right. Any other questions? Well, I'm looking at our time. It's 1:45. We're going to go until at least 4, and maybe a little bit longer. So we have a fair bit of, no, not 4, probably 3:45, because we're then going to come back and, as a large group, report out on what y'all said, and then we'll have a discussion. So let's go till 3:30 right now and see how we do. Let's go to 3:30, and then I'll check in and see how we're doing. Yes, thank you. For those of you out in the audience, we aren't going to leave you just dangling here. We have worksheets for you as well. These are also going to be done at all the upcoming open houses that are starting up tomorrow. So Alice is going to hand out worksheets to each of you. They're organized a little differently than the worksheet that the PAC is using, but they're asking the same identical questions, and we would love to get your feedback. And as you complete a sheet, feel free to put it in the comment box out front, and if you want to do more than one, just tell Alice you'd like another sheet. So observers, we would love to have your thoughts about how to mitigate these impacts or these issues as well. Thank you, Judith. Okay, and Tony. Question.
Thank you, Penny. Question, I know that Vivian had raised this in her letter to us all regarding public meeting law relative to these smaller groups, and how are you handling that?
So the streaming is continuing. We will not have your microphones at each small group live during the workshop. That would be a little bit chaotic. We will have one microphone live. There will be a banner on the streaming broadcast that says we're in workshop session to answer the same kinds of questions that is being workshopped in person. There's a URL to go to the online open house where these same questions can be, members watching can participate that way. Yes, and we'll come back to live for the report outs. Yeah, well, no, it's staying live. It's staying live the whole time. Yeah. Okay, off you go.
I think the one like C1.
I have to step out. We're going to come back, and I didn't know, is the audience going to work on stuff too? Well, we're going to be providing more written comments. So okay. Oh, okay. Let me. Can I get another one? I don't suppose you'd have a pen, right?
I reckon I can find you a pen.
Yeah, I hear sometimes there's seats.
Or if you want something to specifically say, like you only want your project, that's the only thing, then you have to tailor your request so that the legislation excludes anything else.
You know, it's like you have agencies in the process, and you it's going to happen if you don't really
well, that was part of the point about where you have a bill. So in Oregon, it's something that
I should have.
It'd be really nice to have, and therefore, that is putting your restrictions rather than eliminating all of this piece of out. That's all right. Tailor your studies so I've done many of them. Wilson is and Wilson will be right on I don't know. I feel like this is what I was trying to say. One of the lands we do it tomorrow. Have the buses dive bomb and I had a I would get there in 27 minutes and I don't know why some of these things are changing. Like, there is that chance that something like us. We have some of Yeah, 43 I've taken up that goes along because it's too expensive and you eliminate an ally. Why? You just said Rich Lyle, read between the lines, right? Isn't that what you're saying?
So I'm gonna ask for attention out here in the audience. They're having a difficult time hearing each other, so if you could take your conversations outside, that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, that was me. Thank you very much.
A lot of it, a lot of merit to what you're saying. Same issues. Everybody is, dealing with the disagreement. And what you're talking about, I think, is pure probably to the Eisenhower federal transmitter was on to
I did. Sure. I'll note that. Thank you.
Well, I thought I chimed in, that's right. I signed on something. I thought we were supposed to sign in just to come in. When you called me in.
Are you basically just but it's the yellow sheet that's right out here.
I'll sign in.
Because Mr. Hamilton told me to come. I will say that 90 seconds is not very long. I understand. I know you had. I know you did. I like it. It's just different. And I know it's difficult for everything to be done, but at the same time, how does a person really get that concept? And yeah, we can do the forms, we can go online and make that. Somebody has to take the time to read it. Whereas in a forum like this, the person might take 5 minutes to make a statement rather than having to have all the people take 5 minutes to read what you're
Well, I ask a lot if we don't send people, I know that they do.
Well, yeah, it is.
That's the best I can do, just trying to navigate, giving them time to do their work. Plus get the public.
Like I said, I moved here from Missouri. I've seen concepts where let's have the same issue, and until they got finished the entire loop where you had from both sides an avenue with the 270, 255 corridor and St. Brown Salem, they never resolved it. You just don't have enough, and the fact that you only got 2 major bridges out here, that's ridiculous. We're talking about traffic from Mexico to Canada. You know,
My job is to make sure we have a good process, though. Yeah, so
I thank you
appreciate your comments.
Okay, so we're just looking at the... I'm right across.
Yes, but you can certainly... Sure.
I did come up with one, but okay, that's
buses are probably because buses can do it. Buses can pick you up at your vehicle. You know, routing times the difficulty today is the buses have to sit in which is where bus routes because you do your pickups in the community and then you get on a main line and you do 70 miles an hour and you get back out again. But it can be, depending on the route design, almost being
but I mean, this is what I think. I don't know. I'm new to I'm seeing this and I'm wondering, is this genius, our system, or is it just slow and just frustrating? But you know, it seems to me that they should do if you did one more, then you could have the buses on the road, you could make the HOV less, you know, make it free for those people, or buy the unit passes and transponders. You do it one time, and try them. I don't know why it takes so long.
A terrific guy, to be number 2, washed off for being you have to solve all the problems.
HOBs, the W's and everything else, and then you have one source of resilience.
Do you think that the logistics industry is willing to pay for that?
Yes, that is where value prices where the issues, because I am I want our people to be able to price and make money.
I have 100 cars.
Rail has the same freight rail, has the same last mile issue. You can move cars from Seattle to Swanson, but you can't get them from the rail yard or here in to the Safeway store.
I don't know if they're that.
Well, that's the question. Does it warrant it, and it'll be reflected in the cost of your consumers. Somebody has to pay for it. For that Because you're right. A lot of people, this tricycle is something that existing. Yeah. Like it's the quite so it's not like a bike where you take the freeway and pedal as a short standard from here. Loaded up I'm not going to fight that. There you go. So that's how it's come about. Yeah. It's 6 miles less. There's also point. I did. Well, it's so, it's funny because sometimes like somebody on this team
What's always been a problem is that sometimes transferring maybe get away 15 minutes. And this is like the distance, and now I hate it when your pie doesn't happen. So that's why I say it's not to have something easy to do. It's all mode instead.
Fantastic. I wrote a novel on there. No, not at all. Did you want another one? I have a couple extra, but I thought I wanted to share them. Well, we actually have, we've got some getting distributed really soon, so it's entirely up to you if you want. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll put this in the comment box out front. Thank you.
If we were going to do that, why not just build something new if it's not expensive? If I had to choose,
one more lane, 5.5 to 5 across my bridge. That seems to me to be really obvious. I'm surprised it's not.
Yes, sir.
Because I live in Stafford, I can't do full lane. Everyone else is just.
Well, you can, it just doesn't work.
I mean, I love conditions. I think it's fabulous. I did my thesis. I would just use it. I lived in London, it's great. I lived in Beijing.
So, since you're how much pricing lanes and
well, after they implemented car, like average car speed of 6 miles an hour, which is pretty good because it's like
how many cars avoid which way? So to reduce congestion, their speeds. If the goal is reducing congestion, you want fewer cars.
Right. Well, there's two goals, right? I think one goal is reducing congestion. One goal is creating things on the transit side. I think they funnel in those things subways and allow more people to take subways. Because of the stats that used to be. Really? So I think that's, I think that's very effective. When they try
the answer is it only reduces 15% of the cars. But they still are congested. They didn't reduce enough congestion.
And if they hadn't done it, they would have been in Stockholm, for example, 40% before they did their one-year trial. I mean, that she said, they did a one-year trial and they realized the 70%.
But then you didn't fix the problem. The idea is so then to advocate what you're cheering on, you need a better example.
Well, I think the answer is complicated, but if it creates a dedicated funding source that like people are, such that the rate of congestion is not rising as fast, you've prevented future congestion. My friends say the buses are all new.
So future funding source for new roads.
For new public transit.
Oh, only public transit.
I think so, yeah.
You don't want a dedicated funding source to also enhance road capacity.
No.
How about make the roads safer?
If by safer you mean like repaving it occasionally, sure. But I think
the highest accident rate in the state of Oregon happens in the roads quarter. It is 3 times the accident rate will occur in the next highest accident site. Should we make the roads quarter safer with those dedicated funds or not?
When you said dedicated funds, I immediately thought, oh, he wants to build more lanes, and I think you can't really.
Well, how do you make it safer?
I mean, I think if you're talking about that sort of interchange, I-5 and then 3
all I know is the existing Rose Quarter is a safety issue. It's the #1 safety issue for the state of Oregon. And that the amount of accidents is 3 times the next accident rate of any other section of road in Oregon. So if public agencies, you would assume their first priority is safety. Therefore, how do you fix the safety issue?
Right, I mean, I would do that under the...
I mean, if you shut it down, then there would be no accidents, right? As far as the highway, Columbia Boulevard, Cornelius Pass, and so we've got this around Kaiser Road. Anyway, and this is tunnel on the skyline, and we'd like to see a little we do it.
My family has a house in St. John's, so we would welcome that.
Well, it was very, see, the older proposal was all like the Northwest Baptist. This is great. I worked on the wall. I had no idea there was a major business. Isn't it crazy how you have this past and it's like, I've been reading about the New York City subway system, how expensive that is. I want to know why they just dominate. They, you know, it's kind of like, oh yeah, we'll hire they just make some money. It's like hiring American people, you know. I was researching bridge design, and I learned it was in Oregon. This style but even last year, that's a pretty good deal, you know. So I emailed with the original and had received the professor, and there's big companies that do this, so they have all the engineering documents, you know. And it's basically
This job in Central.
how is it cheaper? Well, the diagonal cabling, it's hard to see the cabling requires yeah, and they're locked together where they cross. So it stiffens the roadway. So then the roadway is light.
What's a comparably priced? So what's the similar?
Well, the old steel bridges, if you were to, the way that we did it, they're $1 billion. Now, concrete is a good investment. I did that too. And it's cheaper.
You need one for concrete?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It wasn't just a concrete box girder. It's just different bridge stack, different size, and slingshot. Concrete is cheap, but the construction process is big. And the other thing, in our area with earthquakes, with a concrete bridge, you got a lot of mass. So if you have a heaving earthquake, I've been down lots of mass going up and down. This is very low mass. And then the other thing, the other thing they do is they have new bearings now that sort of wobble and wiggle. And so you separate the bridge from here with these bearings, and they call it so this is, you have less mass, you have an easy way to separate the bridge so that it absorbs. So these win on seismic. Everything, well, we're working on it. I didn't, you know, I concentrated on kind of like the technical stuff and not how to get a political part of it. I know! There is some passion. Yeah, there are some. Are they involved in the some? Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's just usually others are thinking, well, what exists now, and that's where the concrete bridge comes in. But this is a lot. I know. So would you recommend remove or eliminate some of their ring roads and only focus mass transit? Like Beijing, where they not have these ring roads, or London not have their ring roads.
I think where you're going with your question, I think, there is a reasonable argument for some roads. You need to continue to build roads as the population grows, but you cannot assume that those roads should end. Right, so I think every time you build a road, you should build on light rail in that area.
And anytime you build a mass transit line, should you also not assume that mass transit will be enough?
Well, I think
the same thing you're saying about building roads doesn't solve.
There is that the road capacity is already so far beyond.
Okay, we're going to wrap up in about 1 minute. Okay, 1 minute, we're going to wrap up. Okay, we're going to call a close to the small group discussions. Ask everybody to return to their seats. And we're going to share what got developed at each of the tables. Okay, so I've been asked by our streaming camera folks that my table facilitators, when you report out, to come up and sit at one of these chairs up front so you can be on camera. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with one of the tables. And, well, actually, I'm going to start this way. How many tables worked on issue number 1 on the list? Okay, 1, 2, 3 tables worked on issue number, you did too, Kirsten, your group? So you all 4 did. Okay, all right. So, Bridger, why don't you come up to the table up here and just give us the key highlights from your group on issue number 1.
All right. So number 1, just to remind everybody, is about disproportionate impacts from tolling on people with low incomes or who are otherwise disadvantaged. And our group really kind of focused in on low income populations and the circumstance where they have less options and that they've been pushed further from the places where they need to go, jobs, etc. So some of the strategies that we brainstormed, really many of the strategies that are on the list that was provided apply, we said. But people mentioned a cash-based payment system, providing a price lane and preserving for free use of the general purpose lanes, providing more transit that's convenient to affordable housing, providing transit credits, which is another one of the mitigation strategies we have listed here on the sheet, more affordable housing in general, and thinking about priority access to jobs for lower income so that they can get to work. So there's kind of a job development aspect to that too that's not directly transportation related. And we said that really applied to all 5 of the concepts. Anything I missed there?
Great, thanks. And I want to go to my other 3 tables. Anne, did your group have anything additional beyond what Bridger identified? Our group really you have to come up here. Sorry. We're trying to do this for the benefit of the viewing audience.
Hello. So our group really liked the option of providing credits of some sort, perhaps toll credits when folks take transit. That was one other thing. And then also using dynamic pricing. So if the roads are really congested, then the price would be higher. If the roads are not congested, have them be much lower.
Great, thanks. Emma, anything to add? Come on up. And Kirsten, you can queue up right behind her if you have anything additional.
Thanks, Penny. Our group, one kind of
refinement we made to the issue that we've heard is we didn't just focus on low-income groups, but we said low-income and all environmental justice communities. That really framed our entire conversation. And we focused on the importance that strategies that are developed need to be applicable to residents of both Washington and Oregon, and how that the different considerations that would need to be taken into account to make that happen. So we talked most specifically about discounts or subsidies and transit incentives, and raised several questions about how those could then be applied on both sides of the river. And we also talked about the mechanisms and models that will make using alternatives seamless for these communities, and such as the Hot Pass model that is increasingly being used to give people access to multiple modes of transportation, and using either a credit or a subsidy system and kind of tying it in with that technology. Anything to add, group, that I haven't mentioned? Thanks.
Great. And Kirsten, anything your group wanted to add?
So our group talked about...
It's not on. Hit the button.
There we go. Our group talked about many of the same things that have already been mentioned. I will point out that we had a discussion about how point number 1 can be closely tied with point number 5. And for the viewing audience, that point says some communities and locations don't have another option to driving on the freeway. Our group also talked about how this is important for specific geographies, and that should be a consideration, and talking about discounts, subsidies, and rebates as important solutions.
Great, thanks. So I just want to toss this open to the group at large. Sounds like, you were all looking at a number of the same strategies. Sounds like this is a pretty important one to look at those strategies. Did you hear anything that really knocked your socks off, that was like wow, I hadn't thought of that. That was a great idea? Or is it pretty much what was, what you had previously heard, and just refinements on what the options or strategies that you'd already heard about? Okay, all right, I'm going to move on here. What groups talked about the question number 2? How do we know pricing will be effective? Okay, Kirsten's and Emma's did. Okay, Kirsten, why don't you start off?
It's the blood flowing. It's good.
Count your steps.
Yep. Okay, so it's on now.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So with regard to issue number 2, we had a discussion that actually tied to number 7. So I'll focus first on number 2 and then can hop back up here for number 7. One of the questions that came up with the group was, how is effectiveness defined? So first, understanding what the goal is of the application. Is it reducing congestion? Is it raising revenue? Is it some combination of the two? So that was a point that the group discussed in great detail. The other point that was made under this is, if through effectiveness we are trying to change behavior, that may not work because those options that we are trying to incent are not available, for example, transit or biking or walking. So that was an important point that the group wanted to make sure was brought to the fore. In terms of considerations, understanding how the statute should be interpreted was something that our group talked about.
Okay, Emma, anything to add?
Couple things. Interestingly, we also tied issue 2 to issue 7, and our group really focused on kind of, as we were trying to discuss what some performance measures or metrics might look like, we talked about a few data points we've heard about the number of discretionary trips on the highway, but also a feeling that those data points might be outdated, a little bit of lack of clarity of where they've come from, and definitely we identified a consideration as a need for better data for this decision making. Because one evidence of success would be a reduction in those discretionary trips if there are a lot of discretionary trips being taken. We talked about that the evidence of success needs to be corridor and system-wide and not just focused on a small area, so this really could apply to all concepts. And one strategy, or kind of a strategy consideration, straddling that line there, is the need for a long-term plan. So given the growth that our region is experiencing, we can't just have performance measures that are a point-in-time snapshot. We have to have a measuring and monitoring plan that accounts for the continuing growth and kind of a short-term metrics of success, long-term, and what's the next tool we might need to employ.
So I wanted to point out that Alice is over here madly scribing on the wall. Did you get any strategies from either of these groups for number 2? How do we know pricing will be effective? Or any? I didn't. More of the considerations, right? Okay. Anything else from either of the groups on that issue? Okay, how about local or traffic diverting onto local streets and into neighborhoods? How many of you talked about that, picked that as an issue to talk about? 2 groups, okay. Ann, why don't you start us off on what your group came up with on that issue? This is the diversion onto local streets.
Okay, I think this is on. So we came up with 3 strategies. But we also wanted to note before we talked about it that people are already diverting onto local streets and the arterials are congested. So some of the strategies were to implement traffic calming so that neighborhood streets can continue to function. And we want to discourage traffic diverting from the freeway onto local streets. But we also need to improve some of the arterials. This is a second strategy where we want people to be if they are moving off of the freeway. And the third strategy was to use dynamic pricing, which is one that has been suggested for another concern. Some of the considerations as we were going to try and implement these strategies were we look at successes elsewhere similar to the concept to understand the history and how much diversion really was occurring and to try and understand what the balance would be. And then we also identified that really more study would be needed on understanding the diversion and what the price sensitivity would be to that would end up promoting diversion.
Bridger, your group had anything to add to that? You can leave the chair there, it's okay.
Yeah, our group talked about diversion specifically in terms of, I'm sorry, they noted that diversion effects really depend on which RTP projects are built, and that diversion issues may be more pronounced in some areas where there's alternative local streets to the tolled facilities, and it's related to safety and air quality as well. Some folks like the idea of not allowing heavy vehicles on local streets, although that may be difficult to implement because trucks do need to drive on many roadways. We talked about supply side strategy to address capacity or available lanes and transportation options with transit and other ways to address the supply side. Transit came up, providing better transit options, faster transit service, improving the speed of transit. And we also noted that there are some issues with transit currently, including unfair policing of low income was an issue that was mentioned, and low-income fare considerations. And then employer incentives for carpools and tolls was another strategy that was noted. One of the considerations is that the apps like Waze or Google Maps may help people divert onto local streets where the traffic isn't appropriate.
Great. Anything else to add from those 2 groups that talked about that issue? Okay. How about question 4, issue 4, that price lanes may be confusing and hard to understand for some drivers. Any groups take that on? Wanted to get to some other stuff? Okay. Question 5, I think I heard it referenced a couple of times. Or issue 5, some communities and locations don't have another option to driving on the freeway. Okay, Bridger, your group, and your group. Okay, Bridger, start us off, please.
We talked about this in terms of Clark County, but we also noted that there are other places in the metro area that have similar issues, where people don't have other options than to take a roadway that may be tolled. So one strategy was we were talking about Washington drivers reducing their income tax to compensate for the cost of tolls. So that would be matched against toll costs, and it maybe wouldn't be the whole cost of the toll. And that could be applied just to low-income people or perhaps to everybody who pays a toll. And the other strategies, enhanced transit options. Actually, we discussed that strategy for all of the issues we discussed. And then adding capacity to provide more options while preserving some unpriced general purpose lanes. And considerations were there may be legislative changes needed to implement the income tax suggestion. There may be issues that need to be addressed about people that don't have driver's cards and that would be at risk of being penalized. And the use of revenue from tolling to pay for increased lanes and capacity could also be helpful. I think that's it. But we thought that applied to concept A particularly, and perhaps to concepts C, D, and E as well.
Great. Anything you wanted to add from that table? Okay, Anne, you said you guys talked about that as well. Anything additional?
We don't really have much additional to add, except for some issues surrounding it. Except for that, we didn't talk about Clark County. It was more focused on south of the river. There was a thought that this may not be much of a problem, but it has been identified. We talked about the enhanced transit, especially for, or potentially even putting more transit on freeways, and then looking at geographic incentives for people who are in more isolated or communities that have fewer options. We also talked about, in terms of a consideration, that if people have limited options and it's more of a disproportionate impact related to their income, that we may need to deal with those situations in a different way.
Great. Anything to add on that? Okay, all right. Let's move on to who talked about no alternative transit, bike, or walking options exist. Which groups did that one? Kirsten's did? Okay, come on, Kirsten.
Okay, so number 6, no alternative transit, bike, or walking options exist, was also tied with number 8 that the group identified, which is improved transit access. So I'll talk about both of those, and you can chime in if I forget any of what we talked about. So key strategies would be increasing the availability of transit and viable options, adding more transit service, or just adding transit at all, because in some cases there are no transit options. The group felt that all kinds of transit and transit choices should be considered. So rail, bus, looking at water options, and then access to those transit options through walking and biking. The group talked about the idea of creative partnerships, perhaps with some of the agencies, to look at pairing investments. And in terms of the considerations for Alice, because you're making notes on the wall, the group thought that the team should be looking at other examples in other states, and thinking about what the most effective alternatives would be.
Anything to add from your group? Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add the unique aspects of I-205 from Interstate 5 north all the way to about exit 12 or 13. There are no options for transit, biking, or walking, and that's a lot of miles, a long stretch of no options.
Great, thanks. You got that, Alice?
I just missed the exit numbers.
From exit 12, 13, I think 12. About 12 miles, 12, 13 miles.
Okay, all right, great, thanks. Anything else on that one? Yeah, Emma?
Well, ours kind of goes from 6 and swiftly into 7, so.
Well, then, come on up. That's a creative way of approaching the numbers. From 6 swiftly to 7.
Swiftly to 7. So we did start talking about 6 and that exact stretch actually on 205 where there are very limited or no transit, bike, or walking options, and talked about expanding bus rapid transit, light rail, express buses, that kind of thing. This then followed into a conversation about expanding, or if we can spend revenue, or how we can spend revenue on adding capacity and fixing infrastructure. And this led to a strong conversation around lots of considerations and things that my group members would like some clarity on. So I think there was a bit of a disconnect and understanding among some people at my table about what the revenue collected through congestion pricing could be spent on, and a desire to have that clarified. Yeah, and I will also ask anyone at my table if they want to clarify or add any further comments.
Okay, sounds good? Okay, great. Any other tables take on number 7? How will the revenue be used? Kirsten, come on back up.
So I would say that our table of folks would echo some of the comments that Emma made around how to interpret the statute, how to define what congestion mitigation means, and some confusion and lack of clarity around this question. That being said, the group did identify options for revenue use, including capacity, operations and safety, including potentially an I-5 bridge, looking at spending, using expenditures in the corridor in which it is collected. That was something that a couple of the folks mentioned. Increased transit. And then in terms of considerations, there was a feeling that a user fee-based model is most effective. And then this is not really under the nesting of an issue, but it was a conversation that the table had, so I want to make sure that I reflect what I heard. And that was a feeling among some of the folks at the table about the need to look bigger picture for this project and this process, including looking beyond pricing applications on solely the I-5 and I-205 corridors.
Okay, anything from that table that you want to add? Go ahead.
I'll just add that an example perhaps of the confusion is that there was an option that's not being considered. I think it was option 4, which was build a lane on both I-5 and I-205. And that was discounted and then stopped moving forward, not by a decision of this group, but by a decision of the process. But it's clearly signaled, it adds to the confusion as to what the revenue will be used for, because that clearly relieved congestion more than any other alternative, judging by the scale of grading. So I think it begs the question, if here you had the most ideal congestion relief project of all, not moving forward, then what is the purpose of the revenue?
Okay, got that, Alice? Okay, all right. So were there other issues that any groups talked about that were not listed? Yes, Ann. Yeah, go on up.
So my group also talked about a concern with helping the unbanked population, and noted that in some of the materials that about 16% of non-white people don't access banks, and only about 5% of whites, and that bill by mail may not work because some of these folks move frequently. So some of the strategies to address the concern was to make sure that there's a discount for using cash to purchase either a transponder or get toll credits, providing a cash-based system, and in places where transit passes are sold, and they highlighted the LA system as a place to get good ideas, and then also using some type of universal pass or system for transit, tolling, van pool, and bike share to help the unbanked population. Some of the considerations were that it really needs to be easy for people, low barriers to purchase a toll pass or a transponder, mini-marts, community centers, wherever transit passes are sold. Another consideration was that some folks who are undocumented may have some concerns with accessing the toll system and the banking system. Did I forget anything?
Got it? Okay, well that's quite, if you can look on the wall over here where Alice is down on her knees, I think, scribing. Great job, Alice. Or maybe she's just sitting around, I don't know. That's quite a bit of thinking that y'all came up with. I want to kind of open it up to all of you now. Do you think with this list of issues, plus the ones that were identified not on the list but were added, and the strategies that were suggested, do you think there is a good suite of options for the technical team to consider, look at, think about, and apply to the concepts and further refinement? I mean, do you think this is a pretty promising list? What are you thinking about this? Because I know these are the issues that you have brought up repeatedly, individually and as a group. How do you think this list of potential strategies, how do you think it would do in addressing these issues that you've brought up numerous times? Hello? Anybody home? Jessica, just checking.
So I think in general, I mean, these are worthwhile strategies to approach a lot of these issues that we've talked about today. But I still question the ability to be very specific about the impact that these mitigation strategies would have when there's a lot of assumptions about what our road structure is going to be looking like by 2027 that may not, based on what's in the RTP, that may not actually be the reality. And so I'm concerned if we're going to be, talking about what our plan is going to be and what the impacts on the community is going to be, having a realistic idea of what people will be driving on when congestion and pricing is in effect. So I still, this is something that we brought up last meeting. There's been a couple letters about that, but I really do want to stress my desire to see more flexibility in the modeling that's going to be done in terms of either like a timeline as projects are being completed or while congestion pricing is going to be in effect.
Okay. Judith, I'm going to, at this point too, as you hear things, if you want to respond, feel free, okay? Okay. Yes, go ahead.
So Penny, as we were talking about it, Jana and I realized a couple different things. There are some givens as to where this money is going in the short term and the long term. So it would be nice to be able to start seeing that list of projects and how it's going to look out over the timeline. If the tolling is going to be paying for these projects as outlined in House Bill 2017, let's go ahead and what is the cost and when are they phased in, or how is this going to pay for them?
And this is outside of what's in the RTP. You're talking about additional projects. I'm just trying to understand, or are you talking about the phasing of RTP projects, or am I asking the wrong question?
I think I can help clarify.
Thank you, Judith.
There is some confusion that I tried to, at the very last minute, we tried to address. But really, the use of these revenues has not been identified to any particular project. In the original House bill, there was a budget note, and so that is in the policy memo that we distributed. It's addressed, but we can clarify it if you need. But if you look at that policy memo in your packet, or if you call us, it was included a budget note regarding the planned widening on I-205. However, it's of a short duration, and so this PAC still should weigh in on how the revenue should be used. What I mean by short duration is that that direction, that guidance, the budget note was only, it was 2 years. It was only for the biennium that ends in 2019. So really the question is still on the table for you. We do have policy, constitutional restriction, and there are also policy guidance about tolling revenue, paying for the system itself, that sort of thing first. But there isn't a presumption of the revenue paying for specific projects, and it is very definitely an appropriate topic for this group to weigh in on. It is very much for you to make your recommendation.
Ann, you look puzzled.
I am, because we've had discussions this afternoon that, yes, I have the ODOT letter and I absolutely appreciate it. But I think there are some individuals in this group who testified in Oregon and are under the assumption that there are other projects that these funds are going to. And that I absolutely love the opportunity for the Oregon Transportation Commission to be the final voice on this, but let's make that real clear that they are, and there is no assumption that this is going to anything else. If not, then let's get this out into the open and have that discussion so the individuals in this room understand. And so if it's a priority, that they put it on that list of projects that they're hoping for. Jana, is that
so
right?
let's put that down as a
Okay.
note of a thing that we're going to include as in part of our recommendation is where the funding would go to.
All right, thank you, Ron. Okay.
Okay, other thoughts about this? Yeah, Garrett.
Yeah, I think I've been having some conversations with folks about the requirement as a part of this process to conduct a Title VI analysis as required by the Civil Rights Act, and I see some treatment of that in the materials and a little bit of discussion about it here today. And I don't have a very clear question, but one of the things I've been interested in is how can we possibly speed up some of that analysis in order to inform the recommendations that the Policy Advisory Committee will be making to the Oregon Transportation Commission. I understand that it's a longer term process and it's more likely to take some time after the OTC has touched this issue, but I'm definitely feeling as though that kind of information would be very helpful for us at this table to inform our recommendations to the OTC. And so I just wanted to get that on the table and see what people's thoughts were about speeding up our analysis of those Title VI impacts.
Other thoughts about that?
I'd like to share with you the intention. And that is that at this time, looking at 5 different concepts, which are very broad-ranging in scale and location, that's why we wanted to take this moment to really develop this broad menu of ideas about mitigation strategies. The hope is, and I want to be careful to not put the technical team on the hook too much, but I think that they're in agreement that as we come back and provide technical findings for the different concepts, we'll have an opportunity to then more precisely pair the strategies with those concepts in case there are some that are going to be better suited to others. Because right now, to dive in a more detailed, it's just helpful if we can narrow down what the concepts are that are being considered in order to also dive in a little bit more into the environmental justice analysis. So that's the stages that we're going to be taking. So you will know more, I think, at the next meeting on that, and further discussion at the 6th meeting. And David and Trey are both smiling.
I'm nodding.
So they're nodding.
Okay, other thoughts about your discussions today? Any other observations? Yes, go ahead.
So I think we got to one part of the exercise, but we really didn't get to the column all the way on the right. And really, that's really about the concepts themselves and how they apply or where they apply. We did a little bit on, like on I-205, for example, but I think that the concerns are, or the consequences and the challenges for each of these concepts are quite unique. And I don't want to use the, I hesitate to use the analogy of goalposts, but we really don't know where the goalposts are, and there actually seems to be several fields of which there are goalposts. So I think that the objective is, as it is today, unknown of where we're going to spend the revenue or what our goal is. Understanding we want to reduce congestion, that's the big broad picture here, but as far as if we're going to raise revenue to build something or solve something, not really understanding what that is, I think will impact our decision on whether it's concept A, B, C, or D, or other, and also on these mitigation strategies as well, because the question was revenue, for example, and pricing, and those are two different things. Mm-hmm. And not knowing where the goalposts are and what we're going to build or not build, it's hard to really answer those in an intelligent way.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Today we've talked about potential concerns we have around tolling and coming up with mitigation strategies, and a lot of what we've identified here are either technical solutions or administrative solutions to deal with challenges around tolling. But I think more at a policy level, I think the point needs to be made that to ODOT and to the Commission that these strategies regarding, like, for instance, providing people with other options through improved transit, improved arterials, because there's going to be diversion. Some diversion is desirable as long as the diversion is diverting to modes that are appropriate. But those mitigation solutions can't be looked at separately from the tolling plan. They need to be looked at as part of it. And I would include the reduction and improvements of the 3 bottlenecks that we currently have identified on I-5 and I-205. Those need to be addressed, and other options need to be provided as part of the tolling program, not considered separately from it.
So, so I think what I'm hearing is sort of an integrated look. Yeah. Okay.
Well, yeah, you don't institute tolling saying over time these solutions will be implemented. It needs to be part of the implementation.
Which I think is why we're asking these questions right now, right?
I think so, yeah. That fits within the charter of the group, and certainly then within what the OTC is requesting.
Okay, other thoughts? Did you find these conversations useful? Very? Okay, all right. All right, so, well, I don't really have time to call on audience members. Did some of you in the audience members do some work as well? And I will urge you, if you did, to drop your sheets off in the box out there, and we will make sure those your contributions get included in the conversation. And thank you for those of you in the audience who also participated in this. Any last thoughts from the PAC today, right now, about either the issues or the strategies or the considerations before I move us on to next steps? Anything? Yeah, Jessica.
So I guess I don't need to raise my cards at this point. I just, like, as the technical team goes forward with looking deeper into the options, and this is kind of piggybacking on what Craig was talking about, but you know, really, there's a lot of conversations that are happening right now about transit and the transit investments that were made with House Bill 2017, and I think marrying the two discussions in some way and finding out what, you know, because I'm sitting on the transit advisory committee too, and figuring out how we can make, you know, the idea of congestion pricing or the reality of congestion pricing more successful based on where those transit investments need to be made, I think would be very helpful for both conversations that are happening at the same time. And so I just want to encourage, you know, good collaboration between the ODOT team and TriMet and the larger transit community about that, you know, with C-Tran as well. Because I think that for a lot of these, you know, mitigation things that we're talking about, whether it's low-income communities, whether it's people who only have highway access as their route to get to where they need to go. Transit is an option or is a solution that's being talked about. And so I think being really clear with the OTC when we make our recommendations that you can't just be talking about one or the other. You really have to figure out how the planning for both of these is going to make our transportation more successful as a region.
Thank you, Jessica. Chris?
I would be interested at a future meeting hearing more about how freight is addressed in various congestion pricing applications, just because when I heard an earlier presentation about how like a truck can't access in some situations the speedier route, well, sometimes some freight is actually the highest value movement. So I'm just kind of curious how that gets addressed.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, okay. Well, with that, unless Judith, you wanted to have anything left to?
Well, when we come back next time, we'll also be able to share with you from the similar conversation with the public meeting. So prepare for even more. It'll be interesting to see how much they're in line and if we hear new ideas.
So, as I said earlier when I talked over the process, the next PAC meeting is May 5th, right in this very same room, and I believe it's May 5th. Wow, boy, that was good. May 14th in this room, and it's a morning meeting, as is meeting number 6 on June 25th. And as always, we will be sending out a great deal of information ahead of the May 14th meeting, I do believe, won't we? Yes, because that will be the concept round 2 technical analysis, right? Yes. And again, there are a number of outreach opportunities happening over the next couple of weeks. And if you have thoughts, requests, desires for Judith and her group to go out and talk with any of your groups, just let her know. She's happy to hit the trail, right? And I understand you've been on the trail a fair bit. Yeah. Okay. All right. Any questions about anything that we've talked about today from the group? Because honestly, I think we're wrapping up. Yep.
No, I think if there aren't any other questions, I just wanted to start by thanking everyone for their engagement and time. I know it's a big commitment. It's a big chunk out of people's schedules. It's very meaningful. I'm learning a ton as a member of the commission, and I know we ultimately have a mandate by the legislature to decide and make a recommendation to federal highways by December on the 2 corridors outlined. I am more of the mind that we need to look at this holistically and look at not just those 2 corridors, but a much broader loop around Portland that addresses a much bigger area, and that changes this conversation in how we approach it. But I think as we've seen today, it's a little bit of a 3-tiered chess game, that there are multiple levels of it. Not all corridors have the same impact. There are viable options in certain places for transit that are very clear. If you look at along I-84, the Banfield corridor, if you look at 26 from 405 out to 217 and beyond to Hillsborough, there's max options. What are the transit options and what are the carpooling options, and can we create them in other corridors? When we look at the mandate on revenue, and I think to Paul's concerns, I think everyone wants to know where's the money going. The legislature creates a congestion relief fund and leaves it to the commission to determine how that will be invested. The implications are that a congestion relief fund would be used to relieve congestion and be reinvested into the corridor from which we are extracting the toll. So while it's not vividly clear, it seems somewhat implicit to me, and I think ultimately to the commission, that doing what we're doing and investing in infrastructure is very expensive. Our old model to collect revenue is antiquated and isn't producing the revenue we need to produce. Congestion pricing has a myriad of impacts, and I think some is to change behavior, and some is to incentivize people to look elsewhere to be more efficient. And I think the onus is on us to create those alternatives and to thoroughly study the impact that the change in price will have. I think what we've seen today is really a multi-tiered exposure into where we're going. I think it's been very informative. And just as one of the 5 members of the commission, it's been hugely helpful just in educating from point of view and perspective. I think what we heard in the public comment was super helpful and insightful. And again, I know this is not a crystal clear process, but I think the intent is to make sure that we have embraced and heard different points of view and done our best possible job to cast the net on perspectives and impacts so that we can make a decision. I know when we do make that decision, it's not going to address all of these concerns or be able to meet all the intended objectives, but I think this is nonetheless very helpful to informing us on the considerations that we have to do in making a decision. And I am sincerely appreciative of those of everyone putting the time in and their willingness to dive deep into this. I think ultimately Oregon has a history of being creative and innovative. We also have a history of learning from others, from their successes and failures, and knowing that it's not apples to apples, that our unique geography, our unique situation, we can't necessarily take what others have done and make it work here. But I think our neighbors to the north in Washington have implemented this in the Seattle area in different corridors. And I think there's a lot to learn from them. And I think we are partnered with Vancouver as part of our community. And I think we have to look at that. And I think we have to look at our broader community in the 3 counties that, for the most part, compose the Portland region, and figure out if we can do this holistically. And I think there is a way to do it. I think we got to take a step back and say, what's the big picture look like? And even though we are directed legislatively to look at the 2 corridors, we do have, there's a shall clause in there that tells us to do that. And then there's a may clause in there that says we may consider a bigger picture. And I think that it's something that we may need to do. And I think this is a very informative discussion. I think that we have to make sure we're doing the most possible to create alternatives in transit and carpooling and cycling, whatever it happens to be, that we're creating that. And even if it's investing in Abernathy Bridge and creating new lanes on 205, are these things being done that will mitigate and reduce congestion? And I think I've said it before, we can't buy our way out of this problem. We are growing much faster than our ability to solve this problem. So I think it's we have a lot to do. We have some options, and I think we're going to have to get moving. There isn't a silver bullet that solves them all, but I think we just got to take some steps forward to address it. But sincerely appreciative of the effort and input as we try to minimize the unintended consequences of doing this and make it something that's positive for the users of the system. So anyway, I know that's a long rant, and I do just really want to say it's encompassed in thank you for the engagement.
Thank you. Rolando, do you want to add anything? No, you're good? Mic drop. All right, thank you. Well, I don't think anybody will be object to us leaving 10 minutes early at the end of the day. All right, thank you so much. See you all in a month.